Thank you so much, Rachel. Thanks for all of your work on this webinar. And I'd also like to thank Professor Nancy Netzer and the Macmillan Museum and the Macmillan's patrons for the co-sponsorship of this lecture. So good evening to you all. I am Stephanie Leone, Professor of Art History and Chair of the Art History and Film Department at Boston College. I am very excited about today's lecture, and I'd like to tell you why. First, this is our 18th Josephine von Henneberg lecture in Italian art, but our very first virtual lecture. As we've all been learning, one benefit of these virtual encounters is the opportunity to reach a larger audience. So today I welcome you, the students, faculty, and staff of Boston College, as well as all of you who join us from around the globe. And I'd like to shout out to the students in my and Professor Kinnicky's paired courses called Living on the Water. I'm very pleased to note that our benefactor, Professor von Henneberg, is in attendance, along with members of her family. We remain eternally grateful to Josephine for providing this annual opportunity to invite a preeminent scholar of Italian art to our community. Thank you, Josephine. Second, this year, reaching a larger audience is especially important due to our speaker and her topic. I am honored to introduce Professor Patricia Simons, one of the most esteemed and innovative art historians of the Renaissance. She earned her doctorate from the University of Melbourne in her native Australia and is Professor Emerita of the University of Michigan, where she taught for many years. I first learned of Professor Simons when I was a graduate student. I read her groundbreaking article, Women in Frames, the Gaze, the Eye, the Profile in Renaissance Portraiture. Her historically grounded feminist interpretation of portraiture was a game changer in the world of Renaissance art. Disrupting the patriarchal historiography, she demonstrated that portraits are not gender neutral, but rather gender constructions. Since then, Professor Simons has published extensively, books, a bibliography, and lots of articles. Besides prolific, Pat is a generous scholar and colleague. For instance, she has shared her extensive unpublished bibliography on pre-modern women artists and patrons with all of her peers. Third and finally, I am excited about the topic of Professor Simons' lecture. She has shifted her subtle mind and sharp eye to the issue of race in Renaissance art, an underdeveloped area of scholarship. Understanding race issues and racial injustice in the past is important for our work as historians, but it is even more valuable for our work as humans. Please join me in welcoming Professor Simons, who will speak about Black women in Italian Renaissance art and in modern whitewashing. Pat, it's great to have you here.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you very much for the invitation and also that introduction. And I'd like to join you in thanking Josephine von Henneberg for her sponsorship of this series and Rachel for her assistance. And welcome then to everyone else who's joining us in this mode. Thank you for coming along wherever you may be and in whatever time zone. We all need to find some silver linings at the moment, and this is one of them. The opportunity by these means, these digital means, of being able to sort of get together without the time, expense, and now risk of actual travel. So whether you're in Boston, over there in California, or on the other side of the Pacific in Australia, thank you very much for coming along. I'm going to begin with a confession. For many years, I found it difficult, even embarrassing, to teach about one aspect of this painting you see here, Titian's Diana and Actaeon, a canvas produced in the 1550s. The black figure in the retinue of the goddess Diana, there on the right, was often passed over by scholars, or she was relegated to an allegorical function such as fortuna or natura, that is, the allegories of fortune or nature. But that, I believe, does not encompass its crucial effect, dramatic presence, or historical context. Whether there were Black students in the classroom or not, That figure needed to be seen and explained, and today I hope to offer a way forward. The visual archive is not a record of straightforward or transparent facts about the existence of and attitudes toward a variety of ethnic and racial types in pre-modern Europe. Like texts, images must be situated in their time and place and treated with nuance and respect as sophisticated, complex, and sometimes contradictory materials. Artistic observation was always balanced with imagination. Fascination coexisted with fear, and the production and reception of art was filtered through intellectual conventions and power differentials, as well as aesthetic traditions, material practices, and cultural expectations. Similarly, today's modes of interpretation are multiple, overlapping, and changing. Art historians increasingly study the visual representation of Black figures, not only as an iconographic subfield or as an enterprise of recuperation, but rather as part of broader discursive constructions of race. In the Italian peninsula during the 15th and 16th centuries, such discourses were shaped by factors like increasing travel and pilgrimage, growing trade activity, conflict and contact with non-Christian peoples, including inhabitants of the Ottoman Empire, primarily Turks and Egyptians, local labor conditions, as well as the international slave trade, shifts and challenges near and far, the rise of imperialism, especially by the Habsburgs. And it was to a key member of that Habsburgian dynasty, King Philip II of Spain, that this Venetian painter Titian sent the canvas of Diana and Actaeon in 1559. Moving beyond simply noticing the Black figure, I want to discuss not merely the matter of Black visibility, but of what kind and in what context. The goal is to identify ways in which modern commentaries have marginalized or removed the figure, instead arguing here for its importance and for the possibility that the character is endowed with a degree of agency. My study thus belongs to current debates about erasure and action. So in several meanings of the word, the figure was whitewashed, I think. And so here I show you what it has meant in historical terms. First of all, the most straightforward sense of it being used to whiten or chalk over a surface, say in a barn. And then, however, in the 17th century, it came also to have that sense of glossing over something, of covering up not just a wall, but a metaphorical surface, that is a scandal, something that should be hidden, but then it was whitewashed. Finally, much more recently, it has been used to refer to the cases where white actors are cast as non-white characters. And here you see several examples. So the two newer meanings apply, I think, to the Titian figure. It was at first glossed over and treated as a minor or negligible detail, or it was ignored as a character with any meaningful racial identity. But those traditional approaches aren't working well anymore. Documentation is never as good as we want it to be, but the compilation of images has improved remarkably, especially due to this archival project, the Image of the Black and Western Art, which was launched by a woman down in Texas, Dominique de Menil, in 1960, and was published by Harvard University Press in 4 volumes from 1976 onwards, and now amounts to 10 volumes, many of them revised. Over 30,000 works are photographed and most are publicly accessible on artstore.org. And the work continues with now a reach beyond European art in some cases. My feminist work is driven by the impulse to acknowledge power differentials while neither indulging in a blame game nor stripping women of their power. Especially in the classroom, it is too easy to find ogres and victims. And as a minority, I'm a lesbian and I'm an Australian living in America, if that counts. A question I have asked myself is, what would I want to hear if I were Black, and what would be most helpful for me to hear? Now that is for me impossible to answer, of course, because I am living while white, with all the privilege and comfort that entails. But I do want to empower students. offering a degree of hope and fitting them with tools of visual literacy as well as verbal skill, helping them understand that racism is not timeless and that naming it can lessen its effectiveness, as we're seeing very much in the streets of America and elsewhere at the moment. I want students to understand that the history of power can reveal fissures in the edifices of control, and that ancestors from various minorities were sometimes victors in their quiet struggles. Whitewashing is pictorial, but it is also, of course, interpretive. A straightforward case is the Queen of Sheba, who was sometimes understood to be the character of describing herself as comely and black in the Song of Songs, a biblical book. But European art increasingly showed her as a white ruler. A more complicated case is this one of the mythical character Andromeda, saved from a sea monster by Perseus. She's the daughter of two Ethiopian parents, by which it was understood at the time to mean that she was of African parentage. But she is nevertheless depicted as white, including here, as you see, by Titian. And I give you two versions of the painting, one official and one on the left. That's a shot I took to show you under more natural lighting that indeed she looks very white. And thus the character, having been whitewashed, was singled out in a BBC article about whitewashing a year ago. Piero di Cosimo's painting of around 1510 bore the brunt of the critique. But is Andromeda white here? Not only the journalist, but also the chief scholar of the artist does think so. Citing Ovid, he described, quote, the figure of the immobilized princess as pale and lovely as a marble statue despite her Ethiopian heritage. Now that wording is unfortunate, for the despite implies that loveliness as well as paleness are not Ethiopian qualities. It also reads a bit too much, I think, into Ovid, who only said that Andromeda was marmoreal in her stillness, not her colour. She was contrasted with the stirring hair and face. Of course, black marble does exist, and Ovid is not specifically imagining a white statue. The scholar Josephine did, however, usefully point out that Ovid mentioned Andromeda in another text as one of those darkly hued women who preferred to be clad in white, though that white clothing is also a standard choice, of course, for virtuous heroines and virgins. Piero's white paint for draperies, you can see it here, contrasts with a rather brownish grey tinge of Andromeda's flesh. The painter did acknowledge the Ethiopian setting, representing sacrifices offered for her release by men with black skin and oriental clothing in the right background, and depicting the turbaned father on the left, and especially the right, as dark ornament. Along with fantastical costumes and instruments, Piero happily mixes races and types in a court he imagines as cosmopolitan and celebratory once the princess is saved. In the right foreground, the ecstatic daughter Andromeda is welcomed by her parents and her soon-to-be husband Perseus. But what a strange pair. Perseus is pink, besotted and far too young to be a hero. Shaded in the background, the mother is the darkest, the father darker than any of the surrounding men. Andromeda is again of mixed complexion. He's painted pale, but over a greyish brown ground. Piero di Cosimo is trying to have it both ways, adhering to geographic and cultural specificity while not casting the key female character in literally too dim a light. The whitewashing is half-hearted, as it were. Close reading of Ovid's text and close looking at the art reveals a subtle, uneasy attempt at compromise rather than complete denial. Now to the case of Titian's painting, which does have a distinctively African character. First, some historical background regarding 16th century Venetian culture. At the time, Black Africans were chiefly known in the Mediterranean area as slaves, but they were not the major element of the slave trade until it waned in Europe and instead developed across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, European Christians purchased slaves from Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and Muslim lands. This ethnically diverse populace of slaves consisted of Armenians, Slavs, Mongols, Tatars, Turks, Russians, and more. In 1483, the Swiss pilgrim Felix Fabry saw for sale at Cairo's slave market, quote, many people, youths and children of both sexes, black and white, female and male. Though in another market where there were only blacks, whom he called Ethiopians, the Muslim slave traders there would not sell to the Christians. Slaves did not form a clearly distinctive or definable group, and there were considerable differences not only in geographical origin and religious faith, but also in practices, sources, types of trade, and legal regulations. Venice was one of the major cities involved in slave trade, acting as a port of acquisition, transfer, and export. And around 1480, that pilgrim Fabry was struck by the abundance of non-European faces in the streets and canals of the metropolis, estimating that there were around 3,000 enslaved, what he called Ethiopians and Tartars. Black gondoliers and the boatmen were common enough in the 1490s for Vittorio Carpaccio to represent them in two of his paintings, cleverly constructing the appearance of realistic detail. It has been estimated that over 400 Venetian images, Venetian alone, produced before 1800, show one or more African figures. On the other hand, Black Africans were a very small minority of slaves in any part of Northern Italy, and they were less in demand than lighter-skinned slaves. There was also a noticeable decline in slavery by the last decades of the 15th century, in large part due to less access to Muslim lands, and slaves were growing expensive. And of any origin, slaves became what has been called an unusual extravagance, serving mostly in aristocratic circles as markers of European privilege. Art skewed the representation of sub-Saharan Africans because most images present Black males in outdoor settings, whereas the overwhelming majority of slaves in actuality were female, and they were employed in household, domestic, interior tasks, which often entailed wet nursing and sexual service to the master. Venice was also populated with freed former slaves who, if they were Black men, usually worked in labour-intensive occupations like a gondolier or marble carver, whereas freed women tended to marry or to continue as servants. In 1386, the will of the Venetian painter Nicoletto Semitecolo stipulated that his Tartar slave would be freed after remaining with his widow for 6 years, during which time the slave was to continue to exercise the art of painting. So that's some instances of understanding that some people contribute to the cultural production in Europe. That arrangement, by the way, of staying enslaved for a while and then earning one's freedom was not unusual. We know nothing more about that particular Tartar man or his artistic contributions, but the detail I'm showing you indicates that the Venetian artist was able to observe Tartar clothing and weaponry more than a decade earlier. Again, that's partly because of the kind of cosmopolitan circumstance of the port of Venice. But it is crucial not to mistake every picture of a non-European for a slave. There is no evidence that Titian's figure is meant to evoke slavery, though his actual model may have still been unfree. In any case, the adorned woman does not directly or simply record social reality. Like Carpaccio's gondolier clad in flamboyant design, variety to the scene, draw cosmopolitan illusions, and demonstrate innovative artistic skill. Yet, as with Carpaccio's figures, the female attendant is often mentioned simply as an example of the presence of Africans in Venice. Scholars might highlight her exoticism along with the common description of the figure as an aesthetic foil to accentuate Diana's white purity, and I'll discuss that more later on. Or she is reduced to an allegorical symbol with no social meaning. I'm going to try to offer a more nuanced reading, trying to niggle in between the polarities of reality and metaphor, document and allegory, naturalism and fantasy. So first, let us consider the narrative and its meaning. The myth's retelling by the 1st century Roman poet Ovid was well known during the Renaissance. The young hunter Actaeon unwittingly came upon Diana, the goddess, and her nymphs bathing in a secluded ghetto. Angry at the intrusion into a private sanctuary, the goddess punished Actaeon by turning him into a stag so that his dogs set upon him, a brutal death that Titian showed on another canvas. Common allegorical readings of the tale regarded Actaeon as overly curious about mysteries beyond human ken, or as a man unable to control his passions. Being the goddess of chastity, Diana's vengeful punishment for him was interpreted as the right, if cruel, feminine response to improper, irrational, and passionate behaviour. Titian focused on the first moments of the youth's interjection, when the women are just beginning to react. The artist makes the issue of who sees what the crux of the painting by taking on Diana's challenge to Actaeon, voiced as she begins the hunter's metamorphosis. She says, "Now you are free to tell that you have seen me all unrobed, if you can tell." Of course, the stag can never speak, and thus female chastity and divine secrecy remain sacrosanct. Depicting the initial stage rather than the event of bestial transformation, he doesn't even have the horns beginning to grow on his head, which we sometimes see. Titian adds suspense and not only sees the goddess naked, but lives to tell the tale. Thereby, the artist asserts his privileged access to visions of the divine, as well as to knowledge of the naked female body, and he provides his audience with the same license. In normative terms, Actaeon's shock and Diana's anger remind viewers of the social values of masculine control and feminine chastity, core components of the honour of each gender. Simultaneously, Titian presents the enticing view of idealised female nakedness that is no longer secret, but seen by all. He dramatises the interrelated issues of sight and veiling. Between and beyond the narrative poles of Diana and Actaeon, 6 young women perform assorted actions and gazes. Closest to Actaeon, one nymph casts an anxious look towards her mistress while pulling at the red curtain for protection. Another looks down, concentrating her task of drying her mistress's leg, and thus missing the crisis entirely. In the central cluster, a blonde nymph lowers her eyes and starts to turn away. Behind her, another woman has already turned her back and is covering herself, while a third nymph hides behind a pillar yet peeks out, trying to understand what is happening. Playing the crucial role of closing the composition on the far right and returning the viewer's eyes to the action, a young black woman opens her mouth in surprise and helps Diana cover herself. So the drama begins with Actaeon on the far left and ends on the far right with the nameless black figure who similarly raises her arm in alarm. Paid little or no attention by modern commentators, as we'll see, the figure is exceptional yet essential. Ovid imagined that Diana's nymphs crowded around to shield her, and that action of protection was what was often depicted, but in Titian's painting they have not had time to do so, thus enabling him, the artist, to bear the bodies of all but one of the female characters. The goddess Diana has to fend for herself, except for the companion behind her, the clothed attendant who reinforces the veil. The rise, which we can see because her face is flushed with the blush of modesty that is blossoming into the heat of anger, and her vehement defence of chastity is aided and accentuated only by her escort. They act in tandem. The black figure's features are individualized enough to suggest that Titian observed a particular model, and he produced an attractive, animated face. Only beautiful, ever youthful maidens could surround a goddess in her idyllic habitat. However, unlike the nymphs, who were semi-divine beauties populating remote locales, the black woman is thinner, muscular, partly clothed, and sumptuously adorned, thereby adding a unique note of contemporary relevance to the ancient yet supposedly timeless fable. Given the conventions of modern assumptions about racial superiority, nymphs can only be pale-skinned and are usually dark-haired. This black woman is a servant, an assistant, an attendant, not a nymph. But she's more than an ordinary servant, and there are no indications the figure was to be understood as a slave, just the opposite. Venetian regulations that were expanded in 1541 forbade servants from wearing certain items of silk or velvet, and their common fabrics were white, black, or drab browns. Nor were they allowed to wear anything regarded as inadequately respectable, rules flaunted by Titian's arresting garb with multicolored stripes, to say nothing of the bared shoulder. Now, stripes at times connoted foreign, transgressive, or evil creatures, but the striking attire was also depicted on servants and aristocrats. Young pages, one of whom is black, and a woman in the elite entourage of the Pharaoh's daughter, exhibit striped clothing in Bonifacio Veronese's Finding of Moses, for instance, which was not too long before Titian's painting. Side by side, we see a white page holding a dog leash, or several dog leashes, and the black page is entrusted with a falcon and a purse. There's no indication that the African is just a foil to his companion. A long shawl of white, pink, and gold stripes, somewhat akin to the cloth in Titian's painting, is worn by a brown-skinned female servant standing by the princess in the fanciful Egyptian setting of Carpaccio's St. George baptizing the Selenites. The Saint St. George was said to have slain the dragon and thus saved the princess in an Egyptian province. So that's what we have here as a suggestion of Egypt. Carpaccio's fanciful reconstruction of that setting contains many turbaned Mamluks, a few of whom are black. And seeing that black man standing in a group near the center of the painting, the famous art critic John Ruskin in 1884 said that it, quote, frightens me. I can't make it out at all. Jewelry also distinguishes Titian's character. A sizable pearl ornaments her armband, a large ruby hangs from her gold earring, and her hair is adorned with blue ribbons. Aristocratic women wore earrings, though pierced ears supported pendant earrings and some had something of the exotic and foreign about them, disparaged by one Venetian gentleman in 1525 as, quote, the Moorish mode, Moors being people who were considered dark brown and black in places like Spain and North Africa. At the lower level of society, black women were renowned for wearing many trinkets or charms. Aspects of Titian's embellishments thus evoke and enhance her foreignness, but they are neither trashy baubles nor records of reality. They signify her eminence, bejeweled as she is almost as much as Diana. Her setting is not household, brothel, or plantation, but the fantastical world of courtly life and ancient legend. She exists in the close company of a goddess and is one of the most honored members of that innermost circle. The figure is not present in the painting as a representative of all of eroticized and exoticized Africa, nor is she a mere appendage to the goddess. Decades earlier, Titian devised the first portrait we have of a white woman accompanied by a black servant, establishing a type that became popular during the 17th and 18th centuries when intercontinental imperialism and slavery flourished. The prepubescent page in Titian's portrait of Diana, Laura Dianti, has been described as an objectified luxury item, and a black person working at any court was apparently only, quote, a curious ornament or a diverting toy. That's a modern scholar talking. But just as not all Black people can be cast into a single mold, images of them cannot be left undifferentiated. Laura's servant is a child looking up to focus only on her. And the same gaze, along with the disparity in age, size, status, and race, occurs in a later portrait by Titian. Diana's aid, on the other hand, is not infantilized or passive, and it is she who looks most directly at the intruder, not her mistress. Images of Black women, rather than men or children, were not common. African and dark-skinned women appear in a handful of Italian paintings and drawings from the 15th centuries. A turbaned figure, lady, case of Mantegna's Oculus in the Ducal Palace of Mantua, for instance, or by the same artist, but several decades later, as a servant aiding the Old Testament hero, Judith. Or a young African woman cares for an infant in Lorenzo Lotto's St. Lucy altarpiece, her sleeves rolled up to indicate that she is at work, her feet bare. But a large pearl shimmering at her ear gives her status, and her gesture stops an innocent, unknowing child from disrupting a miracle, while her own attentive gaze and bodily posture crucially draws the viewer towards the central scene of faith, determination, and divine power. The diagonal her figure establishes contrasts with that of the judge's ineffectual baton of worldly authority. Her humble position, comprehending and enlightened. In a negative vein, the salacious stereotype of Black women informs Sodoma's marriage of Alexander the Great and Roxana, decorating the Roman bedroom of a wealthy banker who had recently married his long-standing mistress. The celebratory sexual tone of epithalamia, that is nuptial poetry, is emphasized here by a grinning Black woman who eagerly watches the groom approach the bridal chamber, her hands grasping the bed's red curtains so that the cloth between her fingers forms the suggestive shape of a vulva. Instead, Titian's figure fiercely assists in the defense of chastity. And chastity, of course, meant consistent loyalty to the marital oath rather than to virginity per se. She is situated in a visual context that does not pretend to be a vignette of everyday life. Rather, she appears in an historia, that is, a narrative of great importance, considered especially noteworthy, and in a large canvas intended for a powerful king. Interpreting her as a mere appendage to Diana implies that she signifies no more than slavery and servitude. Attendant she may be, but bedecked, energetic, and engaged with the story and its central point about chastity. Now, while stereotypes were rampant, in practice, Black women, like other servants and slaves, were expected to defend the honor of the household they served and to uphold its respectability. However much they were or were not complicit with such patriarchal standards for others, most were certainly keen to guard their own honor, though despair, covert rebellion, and personal assertion led to documented cases of drunkenness, illicit sexual activity, suicide, or murder. Records about the emotional lives of slaves and servants in pre-modern Europe, however, are very sporadic, mainly surviving in legal records. But even in that restricted context, there are glimpses of women who are proud to have been long-term concubines of the European master, or use the word companion to describe their role. With pride and determination, some managed to mount court cases seeking freedom for themselves and especially for their children. Or some even successfully managed to accuse masters of beating them. Under a very prejudicial legal system and caught up in the stereotypes that all Africans were lustful, there was little point trying to bring a charge of rape. But some informally managed to name the fathers of their offspring, implicating European owners and their friends. Complaints by masters about the disobedience, insolence, laziness, or pride of slaves also point to a strong undercurrent of resistance and subversion by those slaves. Titian's figure can be regarded as fighting for her own honour and reputation, as well as that of her goddess. Already clothed, she moves with alacrity to cover the personification of chastity. The treatment of servants and slaves in Renaissance Italy varied widely, from beating and near starvation to decent care and generous bequests. Not all bonds were antagonistic, despite the long-term influence of the phrase domestic enemy used in this groundbreaking article on Italian slavery published by Iris Arrigo in 1955. She mentioned the 14th century humanist Petrarch, whose statement, quote, "as many enemies as you have slaves," was actually about servants, and he owned no slaves. Furthermore, Petrarch was repeating an ancient saying from Seneca rather than inventing a new emotional or personal one. 16th century authors repeated the proverb that derives from this, quote, "we have as many enemies in our house as we have slaves." In 1574, Stefano Guazzo's conduct manual repeated it in his comments about servants, further echoing Seneca and also saying that such enemies were made, not born. In other words, if you mistreat them, then you've got the rebel. Otherwise, these can be servants who will respect you when they are respected. In Renaissance Italy, slave status more often than skin colour was what mattered, and colour was not considered a deep characteristic of a person. Working for rich patrons, a fellow European, a man of his time who could not conceive of advocating for those of low status or different race. His painting assumes that chastity is a universal value, but it is not a conscious manifesto for the inclusion of all races under that banner. The superiority of himself, his viewers, primarily male and white, and the mythological divinity are all assumed. The picture asserts patriarchal, hierarchical, and European values, but it is not without sympathy for the performers of that narrative. Goddess and assistant act in unison, bodies slightly overlapping and curving in similar arcs, arms raised to one purpose. Diana's eyes are lowered in modesty, but her companion looks across at Actaeon in disbelief and alarm. The representative of social ideal. Slaves were to be treated with moderation according to the Bible. In this passage you see here, they were to be treated like a brother and as if thine own self. That too was advice that Guazzo reiterated in his manual on servants. Perfect, loyal servants were like a second self. That is not to say that servants were equals. There is a clear differential in Titian's painting, for the goddess is clearly above everyone else in monumental size, status, fury, and pictorial focus. Yet the black figure is a core player in the deity's sanctuary, much more important than the white nymph, for instance, who's obliviously attending to her mistress's feet. She is not primarily present as a subjugated attribute of Diana, but to accentuate certain visual and narrative distinctions. Her significance is clear if we imagine the figure not there at all. So very clumsily, I've tried to use Photoshop to remove the servant completely. In narrative terms, emphasis is added to the crucial act of noticing and the chaste act of covering, which thus also further underscores the expanse of alluring nakedness. Compositionally, she folds the action back into the dynamics of the picture. Otherwise, the edge is vacuous and Diana isolated, with literally no one having her back. These effects would, however, work almost as well with a pale figure in the same pose. And in fact, X-rays show that Titian did initially plan a white nymph in that position, though reaching her left arm around to cover Diana's genitals. Some scholars believe the alteration was made so that Diana was not swamped by too high a tone in that area of the composition, and thus that the nymph was replaced by, and I quote, the less conspicuous dark attendant. Well, while this might be somewhat true in terms of tone and light, The final effect hardly relies on an unobtrusive figure to close that composition. Titian took pains with the altered flesh. He used layers of lead white, yellow earth, black, umber, lead, tin, yellow, and even a little blue pigment to build up the sheen of black skin. Whereas much earlier, Laura's page was rendered in a less variegated brown, and the later page, closer in date to Diana's canvas, also has less subtlety in execution, though it is a darker skin. Moreover, the skillfully shaded flesh is supplemented by numerous exciting touches of colour: sapphire daubs in the hair, ruby and gold at the ear, glistening pearl on the arm, and the eye-catching multicoloured fabric of stripes. The chief impetus for the alteration was likely to be Titian's unexpected access, I believe, to an actual model. Individualisation of the face, as well as careful attention to capturing the nuances of dark skin, suggests that the artist was inspired by the challenges of first-hand sight. The changes enhanced the narrative and compositional import of the figure, and the painting became more intriguing, emphatic, and varied after one bland, pale nymph was eradicated. I now want to turn more to consider the issue of modern reception of this figure. She's less conspicuous, as it's been called, in modern commentary, to the point of invisibility in some cases. Who sees what and how and when remain very important issues for art historians to think about. Over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, various copies and oil sketches of the canvas were produced, and the African woman always appeared. The rise in race theory during the 18th century, much later than this canvas, fostered subsequent erasures, neglect, denigration, or dismissal of Titian's black figure. Examining the language and tactics used by museums and scholars in the past helps us learn how to speak and see in more insightful ways. In the worst cases, the figure is ignored entirely. A 5-minute video about the painting produced by the National Gallery of London in 2008 did not mention her at all, though it found time to refer to the fine glass that was shipped to Spain at the same time as the canvas. At least she's not been painted out, as happened to Maria Salviati's young female ward, Giulia de' Medici, whose presence was revealed after a cleaning of the canvas in 1930. As you can see from this temporary cameo, Giulia's father, Duke Alessandro de' Medici, was the progeny of a black servant and her white employer. The panel is now considered the earliest formal portrait of a child of African descent in European art. Nor has Titian's figure had the pigment scraped off and repainted, as happened in the case of this portrait of a 19th century free woman in New Orleans. To quote some of the label here, we see an unidentified woman wearing a tignon, the turban-style headdress associated with women of African descent in Louisiana. During New Orleans' Spanish rule, a 1786 law intended to impose race separations mandated that both free and enslaved dark-skinned women wear a headscarf to distinguish themselves from white women. Subverting defiantly adopted the tignon. So it is clear that this is an African woman because of her headdress. Unfortunately, as the wall label then points out, this portrait received harmful repair work in the 20th century. The extensive retouching altered the colour significantly. In other words, the sitter was whitewashed. Even in the painted variants of Titian's canvas, the black figure was not cropped out. Unlike Vanessa Nakate, Ugandan climate activist, who was cut from a photo of her colleagues in Davos in January this year. Because, according to the director of photography at Associated Press, the photographer was in a hurry and, quote, cropped it purely on compositional grounds because he thought the building in the background was distracting. Well, first, backgrounds are not the reason why news photographs are cropped. Secondly, that building actually frames the image quite well. And thirdly, to claim that is just as bad as though the photographer only noticed the building and thus already rendered the African woman invisible. The building could have been cut without slicing off the figures below. The lack of so-called ill intent makes no difference. Racism is not always conscious or deliberate. Little attempt was made to remember Titian's African character in this photographed tableau vivant staged in November 2008 by Tom Hunter as part of the gallery's campaign to raise money so that the painting could be purchased for a British public collection. It had been on loan to them from a private aristocrat in the past. All the characters here appear Caucasian, though the ethnicity of the light-skinned woman on the far right is difficult to determine. She does not appear to be African. Or Callum Colvin's 1998 interpretation of the painting is more thoughtful, wryly updating the scenario by situating it in a living room crowded with such domestic objects as an ironing board and washing hanging on the line. Every figure is present except for the black woman, who is replaced by an upright vacuum cleaner displaying the brand name Hot Point on its lower black section. Nearby, a large pair of black binoculars rests atop red fabric tossed on the floor, a reference to the story's themes of sight and voyeurism. Far removed from Renaissance investment in the authority of the classical world and its stories, Colvin here presents what he's called a Scottish working class domestic version of the myth, where Diana is reduced herself to a kind of domestic servitude. So regarded as a lowly servant, Titian's African figure is replaced by black objects that point ironically to sexual stereotypes about hotness. On the one hand, the black woman is expunged, but on the other hand, thereby no black person is objectified or pictured in a servile role. Without any such sense of irony or critique, however, one art critic crassly suggested that same year of 2008, when there was a campaign going on to acquire the painting, that it was, quote, in all likelihood, a brothel scene cloaked in myth. To him, the presence of the black woman tends to confirm the claim, for his questions here are rhetorical. Quote, does Titian too include a black servant to show that he is actually portraying the courtesans of Venice? Is she the crucial clue that this is a brothel scene? So his derogatory proposition ignores differences between prostitutes and courtesans and between sensuality and pornography, flouts the story's import about chastity, and conflates models with narrative figures. Above all, it perpetuates the insulting, uninformed stereotype about Africans being sexually promiscuous. While it is true that some slaves and former slaves from any geographic region were prostitutes or more often servants of sex workers, that was already a stereotype at the time rather than an actual, let alone predominant pattern. Certain places, in fact, such as Genoa and Sicily, explicitly outlawed the use of slaves as prostitutes. Most commonly, the black woman is mentioned in passing, deemed inconsequential and no more than a black. Thus, the figure is usually identified as possession or accoutrement of Diana, but nothing further is said, so she becomes invisible as a subject. Sometimes there is the hint of dismissal. In 1968, one author referred to Diana as a woman and all the nymphs were instead girls. And finally, however, that same author noted, quote, the little Negro girl's face. In 1985, she was consistently and only the negress, never given the occupation even of servant. Rather, that latter author associated the figure with the allegorical aspect of Diana as nature, thereby once more subsuming it under the role of secondary attribute. Allegorical readings of the figure cloak it in intellectual obscurity, evacuating from it any social, political, or artistic symbolism. No attention is paid to features like costuming, pictorial handling, or facial expression, much less the context of chastity or the dynamics of sight. All that matters in such elaborate moves is the figure's blackness, which enables interpretations of the figure as night or as an associate of nature or fortune. Another subtle mode of marginalisation has been the frequent observation that the black woman is an aesthetic foil to the adjacent white figure. Thus, to cite one example, quote, "The dusky Negro girl provides a telling foil to the fair-skinned goddess." The comet is considered a sufficient and sole explanation for her presence and visual effect. In a preliminary, cursory sense, I guess that's true enough, but it makes the black figure dependent on and secondary to Diana and leaves everything else about her insignificant. To be sure, the goddess is the leading character, but the black attendant, as I've argued, is more important than any of the pallid nymphs. Certainly, ideal feminine beauty was described as white, akin to milk, snow, ivory, and alabaster, tinged with red, which is likened to blood and rose. Yet treatises on the matter of feminine beauty did not explicitly contrast this ideal with any other pigmentation. And the concept works equally well if the companion would be, say, olive-skinned or distinctively different in any other way. Now, around 1590-1600, a minor French nobleman, Pierre Brantôme, remarked, quote, "An excellent painter, having executed the portrait of a very beautiful and pleasant-looking lady, places next to her an old hag, a Moorish slave, or a hideous dwarf, so that their ugliness and blackness may give greater lustre and brilliance to her great beauty and fairness." And that's a passage which has been used in relation to this notion of black figures being nothing but foils. However, the fundamental principle of contrapposto means that a fair lady's beauty was enhanced when, say, she wore a black dress, and it was not because of the clothing was considered ugly. Brantôme here is simplifying aesthetic theory and ultimately not even quite understanding it, because de contrapposto is a mode not of outright opposition, but of concord that arose from comparison more than contrast, from comparison and dialectical subtlety, where each element enhances the other. Harmony and diversity, or what was called at the time varietà, were the desired results rather than binary contrast. In the 1430s, Leon Battista Alberti's treatise on painting propounded the idea that comparison and beauty were relative. He pointed out, for instance, quote, that Spaniards think many young maidens fair, whom the Germans would regard as swarthy and dark. He also picked up an ancient praise of the famous painter Apelles, recommending that the women in Diana's troupe wore a range of coloured garments, some light, some dark, leading to a pleasing, graceful whole. Writing just a few years before the Diana and Actaeon was finished, Titian's friend Ludovico Dolce noted that painters had to find a mean between the extremes of light and dark, which then, quote, unites one contrary with the other. Juxtapositions then of light and dark, young and old, near and far, and so on, commonly employed due to their mutual augmentation, and such charming variety extended beyond pairs alone, entailing also multiple types, postures, and colours. Alberti was not the only person who understood that perception and beauty were relative, and that, in the words of a 15th century poem that was then much quoted, it became proverbial indeed, and was repeated as the inscription on this Italian cameo made in the second half of the 16th century, featuring the profile of an African man, and I quote, "Varying like this, nature is beautiful." While the colour black might have symbolised evil in certain circumstances, in other contexts, including allegory and poetry, black was beautiful, a tradition going back to the Old Testament and Greek poetry. Saying no more than that Titian presents a foil to Diana in terms of painting the black attendant, misses the subtlety of contrapposto and implies the difference in scale is the charming factor. It also infers that white beauty is always primary and that blackness is ugly, recessive, and dependent. But Titian offers many charming concordant variations in the canvas, including fully naked, partly veiled, and partly clothed in the case of the black attendant. As with Titian's representations of black pages, there is a clear power differential in the Diana and Actaeon scene because the chief protagonist is an eternal goddess, whereas the black attendant in clothing, ornamentation, and skin color is a person of the artist's time. But she is not infantilized, and her action and values are in concert with those of the deity. Her proximity to Diana may indeed have symbolic meaning, for it is conveyed in more nuanced terms, however. So Diana is found with her stand of the crescent moon, and allegorical interpretations of the painting claim that the black attendant, because of her pigmentation, represents various aspects of the goddess in her dark and nighttime manifestations. But I would argue that we see coordination and affirmation in the pair. Slipping far off her shoulders, the attendant's upper dress forms a lunar arc, and the sweeping gesture of her two arms enfolds the goddess in a similar celestial curve. A shimmering cloth with golden and white highlights is contrary to nighttime. In terms of contrapposto, her skin color adds variety and balance. Visible, colorful, active, contemporary and meaningful, the black figure is a crucial player in Titian's drama. Thank you. Over to you, Stephanie. There you go.
Thank you so much, Pat, for that very thought-provoking and rich talk, for helping us to go far beyond just seeing the black attendant, but to think about what she means, what her significance is to the whole painting and the kind of agency that she has in it. And I have to say, I really love the way you took her out of the picture to show just how important she is, because without her, that corner just kind of falls off. It doesn't balance and the narrative gets lost. So yeah, she's a vital narrative component there. We do have questions coming in. So let me begin actually with a question from one of my students in the Venetian art class. And this relates to the earring that you talked about. And you talked about its significance as representing her eminence in the scene, her relationship to this courtly world. And I think you were starting your argument about pairing her with Diana, connecting these two in this contrapposto, this unification of difference. And my student asks, or is interested in hearing more about the use of earrings to denote someone of African descent, because we do see them on a lot of African figures, and is curious to know more about how and why the earring became so common and popularized on African figures.
I wish I knew the answer. I would, and here we really need someone who, of course, understands African culture, as that's what the question is asking, as well as anything to do with if it was something that was added by Europeans, and I'm not sure that it was. And it may not be just African in terms of Moorish, and therefore, you know, Moors in Spain were sometimes Muslim rather than African. It was another catch-all term like Ethiopian. So there are interesting sort of Mediterranean and African cultural tendencies that might also be behind it. Ultimately, I don't know if we would say that all piercing of ears came from Africa. I think there are probably other habits formed, maybe even in early medieval times where that was possible. In other words, finding an origin, I think, would be difficult. There is I briefly alluded to the fact that occasionally there's a sense that African men and women could wear baubles, could over-decorate themselves. In other words, were early users of bling, but cheap bling, as it were. And again, I don't know how much that was something that they imported for their own culture, and how much, for instance, it may also have been, as it is sometimes to this day, a matter of wanting to overemphasize or strongly emphasize the fact that they are rich or can afford such baubles, or can at least also sort of somehow or other find a cultural expression in terms of how they handle their own body versus however else that body may be regarded by other people. So there've been a lot of studies about African hair in relation to African Americans in particular, but also in some cases what can happen in the continent of Africa. Earrings and other clothing attributes might be something else that could deserve a decent kind of study. I'm aware of earrings, for instance, sometimes having been cast as Jewish, which again may, however, ultimately mean more about Mediterranean than just one group versus another.
Sounds like a good dissertation topic, potentially.
So let that student get on it, hey?
Right. Right. Great, thank you. Here's another question. Can you say something about the archival sources you have used to construct your vision of Black life in Venice in the 16th century?
Yeah. I've not read any archives directly myself, but I have read publications of them as well as summaries of them. People will select various teasing quotations, and I did find especially very interesting something that's not been drawn attention much in the way I saw it. This complaints about servants as lazy, as too proud, too arrogant. Arrogant is a word that's used on occasion. And I find that fascinating in terms of not just white expectations, but clearly that in the sense that there was a pushback. These servants were not necessarily incredibly, completely, totally, from the very beginning, deferential. That there was some sense developing, nevertheless, of a certain kind of pride. There is, for instance, in one case, an African sort of nobleman who bought his freedom by having 6 members of his family instead become slaves. Now, that was sort of a sense where you could see many things going on there, including then the sense of sort of almost a pride amongst the family members of acting on behalf of maintaining the dignity of their elder nobleman. For the family's honor in general, they would enslave themselves in order then to protect the overall sort of power structure of the family. So, there are different ways of reading things, in other words, that one could, I think, try to see between the cracks. I mean, many, many years ago, it was said that we can't do women's history because we don't have the archival evidence. That's been overturned. Unfortunately, for the case of slaves from any origin, very few of them were either literate or had the opportunity to write anything. There is one man, very famous man, who ultimately worked in the papal court and ultimately was able to obtain his freedom and return to northern Italy, to northern Africa. But that's unfortunately a bit of an exception and has been well studied. So we do what we can, and as I say, it's partly just, the main source is legal, and is where women and men are trying to push against things like awful beatings and starvation, but nevertheless also then trying to read between those cracks and see certain statements that lead us to understand that it was suicide on the one hand, but also occasionally matters of success, managing, for instance, to have your illegitimate child acknowledged as the son of the master who had raped her, and so on. So a mixed bag.
Yeah, and I think what your lecture brought to light is the importance of teasing out meaning, significance, and trying to understand these sources, because as you said, there are so few sources, but we have to use what we have and sort of triangulate among the different kinds of evidence, from the archival to the visual to the historical, political, and that is really important for the work that we do as art historians. And I think your work certainly, you got a lot of meaning out of the visual analysis of it as well, and using that in relation to these other kinds of sources. So that's really wonderful to see. Let me go to another question. This is from Christina von Henneberg. Thank you for this lecture. Christina is Josephine's daughter. What can we make of the Black attendant's proximity to the trees and the dog? Is there perhaps a latent discourse about nature?
I wonder, the trees are pretty important throughout. They're still there also behind the sort of stony ruins to the left of the painting and so on. There is, after all, Diana is nature herself in that, or she's in nature because it's very secluded, it's a very important part of the story, that it's a grotto and so on. So that sense of being encased and enclosed, separate from an intrusion by the outside world and the male world, is an important part of the story. Mm-hmm. So I think to that extent, that's where the trees, like throughout, and some of the stonework and so on, and even the river that you notice is separating them from Actaeon, or the pool, it looks like a river or a stream in the very foreground. I think those are all doing things to try to suggest that this is a secluded, isolated, chaste group of women upon whom then Diana's intrusion is absolutely shocking and totally the wrong thing to do. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what the trees are doing. The dog, I think, is a little bit like the ornamentation and so on that you'll often see at the time, including in portraits by Titian, the lapdog of very aristocratic women. So its primary meaning would be there as sort of a signifying that there is something, again, about this goddess that is exceptional, very noble, very wealthy, very indulgent. However, it is also contrasted very interestingly with a hunting dog on the other side of that stream. So you have, once more, a matter of male and hunting enterprises coming in from the outside world versus the more secluded, domestic, small scale, in case of the dog, kind of gathering of the women all on their own. Mm-hmm. So that's why I think the animals and the trees and nature are redounding to that sense of seclusion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, that is very convincing. You've taken a close look at the entire painting and really thought through how it all works together. Let me go to another question from one of my students. And she asked, what do you feel we should do as art history students to understand better the history of Black Africans in the Renaissance?
Now that's really tough because there is so little that survives in terms of written records. Mm-hmm. But some material certainly survives. Again, not enough, unfortunately, but there is some there. And again, I would have to say that it needs to be Africanists that one talks to. There's been work primarily done on a series of ivories that were carved and imported by the Portuguese. And so on. I suspect a little bit more work could surely be done. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
Could you repeat that, Pat? I think I think you froze for a minute.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, we need best to talk to Africanists about that because very few written records, if any, survive that far back. The main stuff we have, material we have, is objects, of course, including a lot of ivories carved for export by Portuguese to the European market. So that kind of mediation between Europe and Africa could deserve a bit more work. There's been an exhibition and something done on them, but they're a wonderful group, so perhaps more. There's also, of course, these wonderful Benin bronze reliefs, etc. So what you can do with those, I think, would require us to consult with material historians and just see what can be done with, again, unfortunately, very poor sources.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. This next question relates to what you were saying about working with African scholars. So the question is, how much of your research comes from African scholars, and do you intentionally include African scholars as part of what informs your research?
I guess they're meaning whether by African, I guess, would that mean African American and so on? Very few African American scholars work in pre-modern conditions. There's a wonderful African American who works in medieval, for instance, just thinking art history. And more broadly in history too, African Americans and I'm sure some African diaspora people in many other places are beginning to work on this field, interestingly more from the medieval perspective. In English literature, there have also been quite a few people who have begun to work on, or have been working for some time now, on English literature, and have brought in some visual material at times. So it's a condition overall of academia in itself in terms of the representation of African and African-born, African diaspora scholars versus others. Most of the scholarship that I've read that's done things like look at the archives and therefore give me some of these sort of quotes and sense of things and so on have not been African as far as I know. Most of these scholars also working in an art historical point of view, I think, are Caucasian. Sometimes I only know them from their names, so I can't be sure. African and African American scholars seem to work more from the 18th century onwards when they're looking at art historical material.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you.
These set of questions this about African and so on, very, very important. And I'm trying indeed to get beyond the sort of victimization model. And it's that difficulty of identity at the moment and where we are in America. As a white scholar, do I just not work on this and leave it alone? So it should only be African and African American scholars. That to me is a kind of separation and ghettoization that for a start leaves white scholars blameless or somehow or other, again, just so separate as though it's not anything to do with them. And that's not the case, or not what I believe anyway, in terms of, I think it's complicit on all of us standing in a classroom and there we have Titian's painting to begin to find ways to talk about that black figure in the painting rather than just skimming over it. It doesn't matter if there are any African students in the classroom or not.
Absolutely. And I think, this points to a problem in our field, in academia broadly, but very much, I would say, in pre-modern, in the Renaissance and in art history, is that we need more diversity among scholars. And my idea is that the way to get that is we need to cultivate undergraduates of diverse backgrounds, diverse races, ethnicities, to become interested or to expose them to this, to see if they are interested so that they can become the scholars of the future, because that will, I think, diversify what we can do. But of course, in the meantime, I completely agree with you that we should all be thinking about these issues and how they, what was going on in the past and how that relates to the present.
Yes. Because as undergraduate students, existence in the Renaissance. They need to be sort of aware of those sorts of things. There is a move, of course, to claim that there's some kind of white cultural heritage from ancient classical Greece and Rome and so on and so forth that is pure and white, and therefore they need to know these statues were heavily coloured and actually quite gaudy. And so it goes in terms of just having to correct the way in which history might be used. And yes, we encourage very much diversity, a range of students to start moving into graduate research and teaching and beyond. But where are they going to start? We have to be able to at least give them some tools, even if then they work against those tools and come up with much better answers in the future. It's not as though we can just leave them a blank canvas and expect someone who's different from us to start the ball rolling. That again is to separate ourselves out and somehow or other to claim You're frozen, Stephanie. I don't know if anyone can hear me or you.
Oh, I can hear you again. You were frozen for a moment, so you did taper off at the end. I didn't catch the very last bit, but you were talking about how the historiography impacts the way that we see the past. And one of my students asked this question. Racial diversity is not seen in most works of Renaissance art that are now famous. Was this an intentional choice when they were made? Or is it a result of systemic racism during the 19th and 20th century when certain works of art became famous?
It's an interesting question that would deserve more attention. You notice that I did quote Ruskin, which I thought was a very interesting kind of nervous tick by Ruskin there in 1884, to be frightened by the presence of a black face in a painting. Titian's painting is very famous. It's one of the most famous paintings out there in terms of the Renaissance, especially after the whole hoopla about making sure it entered the public collection. So some have black servants in them. 17th century Dutch paintings are certainly getting a lot more attention paid to them in terms of people from colonized Indonesia and so on and so forth. Whereas before, again, figures could just be dismissed as servants and not much more said of them.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not there are a whole lot of black figures in so-called famous paintings that are still there and have just not been noticed, I'm not sure, because of course it begs the question about what was famous when and so on, and what the reasons for that fame were.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there's some freezing going on.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Pat, for answering that. Let me sort of wrap up with a question from one of my students. And since we're focused on Venice, wanting to understand the Venetian context more. And the question is, was Venice a more welcoming place than other cities to Black Africans due to its role as a maritime power that relied on trade with other cultures? Did Venetians regard Black people? I'll start with just the first question. Sorry, that goes off into another direction. Was Venice a more welcoming place than other cities to Black Africans due to its role as a maritime power?
Not completely. The percentage of Black people in Sicily and southern Italy was higher.
Mm-hmm.
Much closer to North Africa, much more influenced by Spanish and Muslim cultures, for instance. Mm-hmm. So, but on the other hand, unfortunately, that was not a high-powered place for the production of art at the time. Mm-hmm. There's more than, again, it's just there is a bias, I think, in art history that we've not looked at as much at work produced that far south of the peninsula. So who knows what more we may find. Mm-hmm. Genoa, another port city, also had quite a few slaves, but again was not necessarily, certainly not at this point in the 15th and early 16th century, one of the most productive in terms of new art. Mm-hmm. So it's another question, in other words, that deserves more research.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Sort of go beyond things like canvas painting, to look at sculptural reliefs, manuscripts, drawings, and so on, to incorporate what we might find out there.
Mm-hmm. There certainly does seem to be lots of room for more scholarship and development of this topic. And of course, in our Venetian art class, we've been very focused on Venice and talking about why Venice is different and special. So we have this tendency to think that Venice is unique in all things, but yeah, it's very good to hear more about Sicily and Genoa and understand that the Venetians were not the only ones who were trading and having contact with the East, but it certainly does define Venetian character quite a bit. Good. Well, I think we'll bring this to a close here, Pat. Thank you so much again for such a wonderfully thought-provoking lecture and for sharing all of that with us. You've given us so much to think about, to continue to think about, and new avenues of research, which is always a good thing. So thank you again.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the experience. Thank you. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.